Chapter 15. I do not remember much of what transpired during our return home, except for the fact we journeyed in silence. Neither one of us had the heart for conversation, our thoughts being too heavily occupied with the horrors of the evening. The house was especially quiet, with Charles and Amelia standing vigil at the hospital. Amelia had set out 2 bowls with our supper in them. It was obvious she had finished preparing them before news of the tragedy had arrived. All other evidence of her culinary handiwork lay in disarray on the counter, the testimony to the severity of the news. I did not feel inclined to eat, my stomach feeling too raw and irritated to accept food just yet. I knew at some point I would need to eat, if for no other reason than to maintain my strength. I knew I had several more hours before the food began to spoil, so I abandoned, for the time being, thoughts of my stomach and focused all my attentions on Sir Happy. What a pitiable sight he was to behold! His whole demeanor was one of complete dejection and utter misery. His air of nobility and self-confidence were gone, completely shattered by an event he could neither anticipate nor prevent. I desperately sought for anything to say which might give Sir Happy some measure of comfort, no matter how minute that comfort might be. I sorted through the typical statements of consolation, like, "He is in the best hands now," and "It could be a lot worse," no matter how hard I tried, and there were several false starts on my part. I could not find anything to say which did not seem patronizing or condescending. Sir Happy was suffering deeply, and I did not want to trivialize his feelings by saying something trite. I did the only thing I could do. I let him know I was there for him. Upon feeling the pressure of my paw on his shoulder, he turned to me with a weak smile on his face and said, "I know, old chap, not much can be said which does not seem like the wrong thing. It was hard for me when Annie left. I was never sure what to say. I guess now our roles are reversed a bit. I will say it is some comfort to have you here with me. I do not think I could bear to be alone." We sat through the night together, listening to the hiss of the coals as we waited. It was not until 3:30 the following morning when Charles and Amelia finally arrived home. I had reached the point of exhaustion where it feels as though the body has not enough energy to experience emotion, when suddenly the door opened and in walked a very drained and exhausted Charles and Amelia. Poor dears, their eyes were darkened by the shadows of weariness, and lovely Amelia, her eyes were so swollen from crying, one could hardly tell if they were opened or closed. I knew the face of sorrow, and both Hursts were wearing it. For a moment I was terrified Stephen was lost to us forever. Apparently my apprehensions were shared by Sir Happy, for as I ran to the door with dreaded anticipation of the news, I found myself very quickly outstripped by Sir Happy himself. As soon as he reached the door, he began barking demands for an update. All semblance of decorum was gone from his behavior, having been consumed by the burning desire to know how his precious master was. I, for my part, had lost all appearance of fatigue, having been instantly rejuvenated by the promise of news, although I dreaded the possibilities, knowing they could not be good. I found an odd comfort in the knowledge the burden of uncertainty would soon be lifted. A look of concern and great compassion went across Amelia and Charles's face as they received their manic and demanding greeting from Sir Happy. For, of all the individuals involved in this monumental tragedy, Sir Happy had the most to gain or lose from the news. "There, old boy," Charles said in a warm and soothing voice, "allow me a moment to sit down, and I shall tell you everything I know." Charles made his way to an overstuffed chair by the fireplace, and eased his weary body onto the welcoming cushion. From the looks of it, it was the first time his body had been in a seated position since the whole ordeal began. Charles let out a great sigh and closed his eyes. He was overcome with exhaustion and was in obvious need of food and rest. I was afraid our friend was falling asleep, and I found myself momentarily uncertain if I should rouse him or let him sleep. As I contemplated the various methods I might use to ease Charles back into the world of consciousness, Sir Happy trotted over to him and did something that, up to this point, I had never seen him do before. He stood on his shoes until the young man opened his eyes, and at the moment when Charles looked down to see what was on his feet, Sir Happy sat upon his haunches and begged to be picked up. Upon first examination, this might not seem like much, the dog asking to be picked up. Were we dealing with any other canine, I might dismiss the gesture as being solely focused on seeking attention or affection. After all, who does not like a good scratch behind the ears? I must admit I have sought my share of head scratching. It is part of our nature, and it is an activity which can bring great contentment. But this was no ordinary everyday canine. This was Sir Happy. There was a great deal more to his actions than a desire for an ear scratch or a belly rub. Sir Happy's heart was breaking, and the incredible spark of life which had always been in his eyes was beginning to fade. So connected was he to his beloved master, Sir Happy's very existence hinged on the health and well-being of the man whose condition was currently unknown to us. As Sir Happy sat upon his haunches, staring intently into Charles's face, every fiber of his being was begging, pleading for news, for information, for anything which would let him know if the person who was the center of his universe and his entire reason for living was indeed still upon this earth. There was no mistaking the whimpers and whines which began to issue forth from Sir Happy as he balanced precariously before the overstuffed chair. Anyone who would argue animals were devoid of the same types of emotions people experience has never truly listened nor observed the multitude of creatures around them. We emote and express ourselves as clearly as any person, if only the observer is willing to take the time to listen. Perhaps our language or our mode of communication is a bit different when compared to the average human being, but our hearts are the same. We furred and feathered creatures know joy and excitement, passion and disgust. We suffer the bitter taste of disappointment and celebrate an exultation when we triumph. We love and laugh, and yes, we grieve. When separated from the ones we love, whether from death or distance, our hearts pour forth the sorrow which has no end. The pain can only be alleviated at the moment we are reunited, and then, oh, such bliss as man has never known. It is like falling in love all over again. You see, we creatures live our love as if we only have a single moment with the objects of our affection. Our job, our goal in life, is to wait for our reunion with our precious ones. Oh yes, at times we entertain ourselves and keep our faculties busy, but all the while our hearts and minds are centered around the moment when our beloved comes through the door. And when the blissful reunion occurs, the rest of the world melts away as if it never existed, replaced instead by our one great love. There is nothing else we live for. In fact, we cannot live without our beloved. The loss of that great one can be devastating to a point where there is no recovery for the pet. Sir Happy's plea was as much for his life as for anything else, and thankfully Charles understood it. Without hesitation, he bent down and picked up Sir Happy from the floor. He knew of all the people in the entire world, he had the only means of offering comfort and hope to Sir Happy. He had a chance to give this grief-stricken dog something to hold on to get him through. Charles was incredibly gentle, as though he were dealing with a young child who needed comforting after a bad dream. "There now, that's better," he said, as he tucked him in the seat next to him. "I'm sorry for nodding off for a moment. I was just overcome by weariness, but I'm better now. I know this has been a very trying time for you, waiting here in this big, empty house, not knowing what was happening to Stephen. It made me positively furious when the nurse expelled you from the hospital, as if you did not matter." Amelia, who up until this point had been sitting quietly in the corner, sniffling and wiping her nose, jumped up and began ranting about the nurse. "The nerve of that woman, treating the two of you in such a deplorable way. Well, I gave her what for. Filthy indeed. I told her I trusted your cleanliness more than I trusted hers. Did you see her fingernails? They were absolutely scandalous. And her uniform. I asked her if she bothered to use soap when she scraped it out on her rock." The incentives continued as Amelia went through the list of insults, character assassinations, and familial witticisms she leveled at the hapless nurse. I was even surprised to discover Amelia had challenged her to step outside the confines of the hospital for a hand-to-hand combat. How like this marvelous woman to be as passionate in her defending as she was in her loving. I felt instantly vindicated in considering Amelia's fiery nature. I actually began to feel sorry for the old nurse. Amelia's anger could be downright glorious. Thankfully, for those of us who loved her and called her friend, her wrath only boiled to the surface when she found herself defending one of us. It was charming, really, unless you were the unfortunate recipient of her fury. I was eagerly anticipating further details of her battles with the nurse when Charles very sweetly interrupted her rant to remind her of the delicate feelings of Sir Happy. "Dearest, rather than bombard Sir Happy and Mr. Marmee with the details of your confrontation with Nurse Abernathy, allow me first to give them the particulars of Stephen's condition and all details surrounding his case. Then you can share how you made the old woman cry." Amelia's face colored a bit, realizing for the first time how forceful she had been. Considering how gentle and truly amiable she was, I think she was a bit repentant of her treatment of the nurse, but her regret only went so far because she countered with an indignant, "Well, she ought not to have treated them the way she did." She trailed off with, "They have feelings too." Amelia quietly took a seat, still brooding over the events of the previous evening. Charles could not resist the flush of color which came to his wife's cheek when she was angry. He sat there for a moment, admiring the large heart and unquenchable passion of the woman who was his own dear Amelia. Remembering his commitment to Sir Happy and myself, he shifted his attention back to us and the situation at hand. "I must tell you, Stephen is alive, but just barely. He is in critical condition right now and must be closely monitored around the clock. I'm sorry to say his wounds are most grievous. The blood loss alone could kill him, but if he survives it, there is a high probability of infection. Stephen has some nasty wounds on his neck and several more on his forearm that look like he managed to keep from getting his throat ripped out by cramming his arm into the beast's mouth when it let go of his neck to get a better grip. The maneuver probably saved his life. I will say this, however. The creature aimed his bites well. He hit a major artery in Stephen's upper arm, which is where most of the blood loss came from. Thankfully, Stephen kept his wits about him and managed to tie off his arm with a handkerchief to slow the blood flow before losing consciousness. It's a miracle the creature didn't come back to finish him off." Sir Happy whimpered and began to tremble, as if overcome by a frigid wind. Charles gently stroked his head, tracing the soft hairs between his drooping ears. "I'm so sorry, old boy. Wish I had better news to give, but I don't. I don't want to deceive you by telling you things are better than they really are. You would see past the falsehood if I tried to offer one. You always do. As Charles disclosed the bleakness of Stephen's condition, I felt a cold shiver course through me. I was incredibly uncomfortable with the news, because with every declaration, it felt as if Stephen's chances were growing slimmer and slimmer by the minute. I feared even now he had slipped away as we sat here discussing his condition. I was torn between a desire to leap into some constructive activity to keep my mind and heart focused off the potential loss of a dear friend, and the urge to curl up in some dark corner of the house and sleep until this terrible nightmare was over. Amelia came over and scooped me up from the floor. Her touch was comforting to me, and although she was not my sweet Annie, she was a good substitute. Her gentle voice cooed words of comfort to me, making me feel a little less like my insides were being ripped out through my nose. "Charles," she said, just barely above a whisper, breaking the silence which had enveloped us all, "tell them about Stephen's doctors. It might offer a bit of comfort to them to know who is keeping watch over him." Charles gave his wife a look of deepest gratitude, thankful to have some positive subject involving Stephen to focus upon. "Well, there's a bit of good news in all this. Apparently, a well-known physician named Dr. Lister was visiting at the hospital, and as soon as he heard about Stephen, he insisted upon his being assigned as the head of the physician team taking care of Stephen. It was most impressive, given his reputation. We were given every assurance he was the best doctor in the country." Sir Happy perked up for the first time since the Hearsts arrived at home. I saw a bit of spark return to his eyes as he looked at me and exclaimed, "Did you hear that, Mommy? Lister stayed on after treating Penny." His tail began to wag as he contemplated what this new information meant in regards to his beloved Stephen. Sir Happy was just about to jump down from the chair when Charles caught him gently around the chest and restrained him from further displays of exuberance. "Wait a minute, Sir Happy. It is exciting news because it means Stephen will get the best care, but it does not mean he is out of the woods." Sir Happy stopped all movement and looked directly into Charles's eyes, pleading with him to explain. "Dr. Lister said Stephen was in a very bad way, and he was reluctant to make any promises about his recovery. We were advised to go home, get some rest, and pray, because it would take a miracle for Stephen to survive the night." There it was, the ugly truth of the situation. Stephen was dying, and nothing but divine intervention could change that. Sir Happy struggled against the arms which held him, and upon reaching the floor ran from the room, leaving the rest of us to the ensuing silence, a silence which was broken only by the occasional sniffle of Amelia. After a moment, Amelia placed me on the floor and moved off in the direction Sir Happy had taken. Before she had taken 3 steps, Charles reached out and stopped her, saying, "Darling, we must leave him for a time. Sir Happy must come to grips with the reality of the situation on his own terms. There's nothing we can do to ease his suffering or to make this any less horrifying than it is." "I just..." Amelia's voice trailed off, her statement cut short by the reappearance of her own tears. Charles drew his tender-hearted wife to him, offering what comfort he could as they both grieved for their dear friend. I suddenly found myself feeling very much alone, without answers or a source of comfort to help soften the blows of the news. I left the woeful couple to their whispered words. Curling up in my bed, I sought the solace of slumber, fully expecting my whirling mind would prevent me from reaching the blissful darkness of sleep. As I lay there contemplating the day, the exhaustion from earlier returned, carrying me very quickly into oblivion. I wish I could say my slumber was devoid of all rest. Unfortunately, I was I was plagued with hellish nightmares, which left me more distressed than I was when I first lay down. I will not give voice to the things I saw in my dreams that night, so terrible were the images. Suffice it to say, I was haunted by the remembrance the following morning as I walked through the house seeking the company of my friends. It was a little unnerving finding myself completely alone. The silence made it even harder to shake off the disturbing feelings my dreams had caused. I decided to seek comfort in a hearty breakfast, and very quickly made my way to the kitchen to see what I could find. Amelia, to her credit, had set out some smoked kipper snacks and a bit of day-old bread soaked in cream for my breakfast. A plate had been left for Sir Happy, but it had been left untouched by him. I assumed from their absence, the Hursts had returned to the hospital to be there with Stephen. From the looks of it, Sir Happy had not slept in his bed the entire night, which made me wonder, with great anxiety, where he had been. Had the situation been other than what it was where the dreadful nurse was concerned, I would have believed him to be at the hospital with his beloved Stephen. But considering the events of last night with the nurse, I knew it was not the case. I began to worry about Sir Happy as I contemplated Stephen's dire condition. My thoughts immediately turned to what Dr. Lister had said about it taking a miracle for Stephen to make it through the night. Was it too late? Would the Almighty hear me if I cried out for a miracle now? I walked from room to room, seeking a place of solace and comfort in which to make my plea. But what I found was Hanover Place felt as hollow and as empty to me as I felt inside myself. I could not have felt farther from the presence of the Almighty than I did at that moment, and what made it so terrible was what I needed more than anything was to feel as though the Lord was near. I did the only thing I could do. I went to the one place where I felt I had the best chance of being heard. Chapter 16. As I walked from the lonely vestibule to the grand theater of the church nave and down the center aisle toward the sanctuary, I found myself immersed in an environment which commanded reverence and an attitude of contemplation. It was neither the elaborate murals nor the delicate stained glass windows, both of which celebrated the deeds of biblical men and women of old, which inspired the incredible sense of awe I felt. Nor was it the architectural wonder of the high vaulted, gracefully arched ceilings of the old church which took my breath away. What I felt went beyond the physical. It transcended reason and quite truthfully was beyond what could easily be explained. I felt quite certain, were I to close my eyes and listen very closely, I could hear the echoes of a million whispered prayers offered on behalf of countless people across the centuries. Up to this point in my life, I had never really given faith much thought. Granted, I had been to church before with my sweet Annie, and I had sat beside her many a night as she prayed. I knew the process of faith, but had little of my own. With Stephen in the hospital, very near death, I was suddenly faced with the very real question of, what do I believe? My heart cried out for understanding, for truth. I again felt how small and insignificant I was, especially in the eyes of the Creator. Why would He care about the needs of one small feline in the face of so many other needs? In the eyes of man, was I not considered one of the lowest and most worthless of creatures? I could not pull a carriage like a horse, nor perform countless hours of labor. I could not protect my beloved Annie from harm the way a canine could. I could not offer milk like a cow or a goat, nor could I clothe the masses like a sheep with its wool. I had nothing to offer anyone but myself. I had only love and friendship to give, and such things could not be measured. They had no physical substance, no discernible worth. I would give my life for Stephen, but I had no way to save him. I felt smaller than I ever had. I looked to heaven for answers. Could the Almighty hear the prayers of my heart? Did he even care? All of the uncertainty, frustration, and need emptied out of me in one giant torrent of prayer. As I poured out the contents of my heart, I imagined myself lamenting in the face of a great wind, quite certain my prayers had as much chance of reaching the ears of the Almighty as I would have of being heard above the tempest. I needed to know I was not alone. More than anything, I needed to know the Creator heard me and that I mattered to him. In my pain, I cried out into the air of the empty church, my voice resounding back to me tenfold. I had not meant to vocalize, but I could not contain all that was in me. What hope did I have? A voice broke through my miserable musings, shattering the silence with undeniable rich tones. "Hello, little one." The church had been empty when I arrived, so I felt there was only one possible source for the greeting. God was answering me. I cannot express to you how terrifying I found the thoughts to be. It was one thing to need an answer from the Almighty. It was quite another matter to receive one firsthand. I knew I should not keep God waiting. After all, he was extremely busy, so gathering what courage I had left in me, I turned in the direction of the salutation, fully prepared to meet my Maker. I must admit, at first glance, I was a little disappointed in what I saw, having fully expected to become immersed in some heavenly vision, like those depicted in the murals on the walls. What I discovered was the stark reality of an old man standing in the aisle behind me. Although I might have preferred a vision of the Almighty, there was something inexplicably appealing about this octogenarian. His eyes reflected a kind of wisdom which comes from experiencing life at its fullest, both the heartache and the joy. This old man had seen much in his long life, and I was quite certain he had a crease on his face for every year and every experience. His smile was comforting to me, however, and as we regarded each other, I found a measure of relief from the turmoil which had originally brought me here. "Might I join you in your contemplation?" he asked. I gave my consent by moving over in the pew I was perched upon, finding reassurance in the sudden appearance of this unexpected company. "I could not help but overhear your sorrowful wail a moment ago, and I thought perhaps it would be prudent for me to come over and see if there was some way for me to offer my assistance. Now, if my memory serves me correctly, you are Mr. Marmee, the very precious pet of young Annie Worthington and the current house guest of Dr. Stephen Hanover." I can only imagine the image I presented, for I know for a fact I was sitting with my mouth hanging wide open as I stared disbelieving at this clairvoyant white-haired old man. He laughed heartily at my reaction and reached over with a very gentle hand and pat me on the head. My initial response was to pull back, not wanting to be touched by someone who dabbled into divination. He read my thoughts anew because he immediately offered me every assurance he was not telepathic. "My dear Mr. Marmee, take comfort. I make it my business to know both the two and four-legged members of my community. I know your story only because I have known Stephen Hanover for many years, from the time he was an infant, in fact, and he told me many months ago about your joining his household. I have been anxious ever since to meet you. He was very detailed in his description of you and your sweet Annie, so when I saw you sitting here in the pew, I knew you had to be the same marmalade-colored cat which he had told me so much about. I also know Stephen is in the hospital fighting for his life,
So where else might I expect to find a dear friend of his than in the house of God, praying for a miracle?
He paused for a moment and looked around as though admiring the beauty of the church in which we sat.
Incidentally, my name is Phineas Cooper, and I care for this church. It has been my charge for over 50 years now, and I am glad to have a chance to share it with you.
I liked this old man, and it felt, oddly enough, as though he understood me. We sat for a time together, neither of us breaking the silence, but merely sharing the vigil of private prayers offered on behalf of Stephen. I cannot say how long we sat in silence together, but the company of this wise old man gave me a kind of comfort I had not felt nor could have expected since discovering Stephen's bloody body lying helplessly in the street. It was the kind of consolation I might have expected had I been sitting with my own sweet Annie. The silence, however, was finally broken by my companion.
Many people come seeking comfort within the walls of this old church, being burdened with troubles which extend beyond the initial burden which brings them through the front door. Most souls labor with the burning question, does God care? Of course, in our hearts it is a much more complex issue than this simple question implies. There are the far deeper uncertainties of whether he cares for us personally, whether he listens to the contents of our hearts, and whether we matter to him or not. From the look and sound of it, I would imagine some part of all these questions were circling through your mind and heart at the moment when you cried out. Perhaps you were even asking yourself if you were worthy of his love. Am I somewhat correct?
I stared in amazement at this man who had single-handedly managed to read the very contents of my heart, as though it were a book open for his perusal. Never before had I been so easily understood, not even by my own sweet Annie. How could a stranger know so much about me when I had told him nothing, when I could tell him nothing of what I was thinking and feeling? Mr. Cooper gave me a knowing smile and said,
Mr. Marmee, I knew these things about you because so many others have come before you asking the same kinds of questions. At some points in our lives, we all ask these questions as we seek for truth and meaning in our lives. I myself came to this dilemma many years ago when I was a young man, and I know how painful and how uncertain the quest can be. I'm neither here to give you a sermon nor to give you answers which your heart is not ready to receive, but I will say this: you are not alone, nor have you ever been alone. Think back upon the blessings of your life, both past and present. Remember the moments where you have been saved from harm and blessed with goodness. Think about your own sweet Annie and how wonderful life is with her. Concentrate on the love in your life and the friendships you have been given. All of these things are blessings which you have not earned, yet they are blessings which have been bestowed upon you by a God who loves you. He cares very intimately about the burdens and worries of your life. He also cares very deeply about the health and well-being of your friend Stephen. Nothing escapes his notice, not even the things which are buried within the deepest recesses of your heart.
I took the old man's advice and looked back over my life. The blessings were unmistakably abundant. Instead of dying in the rubbish heap as a kitten, Amelia found me and brought me to Stephen's clinic, where I was saved and given to my sweet Annie, who has loved me my entire life. My best friend is a dog, albeit a quirky dog, which goes against what some would call the natural order of things. I have been given the rare gift of being in a position to help others by bringing to light the injustices which have been perpetrated against them. So many blessings went through my mind and I will not suffer my listener to go through each one. But suffice it to say, I was there for quite a long time as I enumerated within my heart the abundance in my life. How long I sat there in contemplation, I do not know, but my reflections were made in the presence of this man who understood my journey. When I finally looked back at him, Mr. Cooper smiled at me and said,
I hope you will consider me a friend, Mr. Marmee, as I would very much like to consider you as such.
I purred my approval at the suggestion, being glad to be counted among his friends.
Incidentally, I believe there is a mutual friend of ours here, someone who you might be very glad to see. He's been here the entire night, and I feel quite certain he would be most glad to see you. If you will follow me, I will lead you to him.
As I followed Mr. Cooper from the grand theatre of the church towards a small chapel, which had been hidden in a corner behind one of the many large pillars, I tried to anticipate who this mutual friend might be. What I could not have foreseen was finding my dear friend Sir Happy lying on the floor in the front of the chapel's dais, praying for the recovery of his precious Stephen. Sir Happy was just as surprised to see me walk in behind the old man.
Sir Happy, you have a visitor, Mr. Cooper said as we walked in. I have a few things to attend to, so I shall leave you both to your private conversation.
For a moment, Sir Happy and I stood there staring at each other, uncertain what to say. Mr. Cooper had turned as if he intended to leave, but then he turned back to add,
There's nothing so comforting as the presence and understanding of a friend during those moments in life when circumstances become too great a burden for one person to carry alone.
He then offered us both a warm smile as he returned to the main theater of the church. I realized as I stood there facing my friend, I had nothing to fear from him, nor he from me, so I braved the silence by asking, Would you mind if I joined you? Sir Happy's face relaxed with relief as he said,
I welcome the company, my friend.
It matters not how long we remained together in the church, nor is it critical to recount every word said between us during our time there. What mattered most was the blessing of friendship Sir Happy and I shared. I had never doubted he and I would remain friends forever, but finding each other in the church at the same time for the same reason cemented our devotion to each other beyond what I might have expected. By midday, we took leave of the church sanctuary and wended our way home to again reclaim the task of waiting for news of Stephen. But things were not as they had been the evening before, for both Sir Happy and I felt a sense of peace which had not been present last evening. As we walked into the comfort of the front parlor, which had become one of my favorite rooms in the house, we were surprised to find Amelia and Charles waiting anxiously for our return. Although they both still had a look of exhaustion about their eyes, I detected a hopefulness in their faces which helped to lift any residue of anxiety from my heart and mind. There you are, began Amelia as she bent down to scoop me up from the floor. Charles, in turn, reached down to pick up Sir Happy. We were just beginning to get worried about you, both when we discovered you were gone from the house, she continued. Charles looked at his wife with a pensive grin and asked her, Should we tell them the news? With a nod of her head, Charles looked back at us and said,
Stephen has made it through the night, and his vital signs have apparently stabilized, much to the satisfaction of the hospital staff. He's not out of the woods yet, but the doctor said it was a hopeful sign he's still with us. At this point, Amelia interrupted and added,
And with such promising news, we thought you two might find your appetites again and be willing to eat a little something to keep your strength up. I knew she was talking specifically to Sir Happy, who had eaten nothing since the previous morning. But since I was a great admirer of food, especially the delicacies created by Amelia's own hand, I was more than willing to eat again, for her sake. The four of us had barely sat down to enjoy the meal the sweet lady of the house had prepared when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. None of us were anticipating a visitor, and so it was with great trepidation Charles left us to answer the door. It took less than a moment for the rest of us to follow fast on his heels.